Are we live? I guess we're live. Okay, so hi everyone, once again for the second edition of Subvisual Live Talks. This week, I have the pleasure of having Saša Jurić. But before we get into that, and before I forget, if you have any questions that you want to ask during this session of Subvisual Live Talks, tweet them at Savisual Talks, this hashtag, or you can just ask them here on Twitch on the chat, and we'll be asking them to our guest. And without further ado, Saša, welcome. I don't know if I'm pronouncing your
Hi,
name correctly.
it's Sasha. Yeah. Hi. Am I live?
You're alive. You're also live now. So,
Yeah.
first of all,
Okay.
thanks so much for taking the time to do this.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me. Yeah.
No problem. I would like to get to started as I did last week, just trying to understand what was your first interest in tech. Like, when did you realize that tech was something that you liked? Was it early on?
Mm. Yeah, it was, I think, relatively early on. I started programming with 13 when I was 13. So the backstory is like when I was a kid, and as I would visit my friends and some relatives, and they would have some of these gaming computers. So that was happening in the 80s. Some of them would have like Commodore 64 or Spectrum, or some luckier would even have a computer called Amiga. I don't know if you heard of that one. That one's pretty legendary. And then, of course, obviously, I was trying to persuade my parents to get me some of that. But I think at the time it was like pretty expensive, and so it took years since they finally got a computer, and instead of getting any of those computers, they actually got PC. It was 8086 processor, so it's so-called XT computer, and you couldn't really play a lot of games on those, like maybe Pac-Man, Tetris, and stuff like that. But as it just so happened, we had some basic programming at school at the time, like literally the language called BASIC. And I also had a friend who had a PC computer and who already programmed stuff for a while. So he showed me a couple of tricks. And basically, because I didn't have anything else to do with this computer, I had to start programming. And as soon as I wrote, I think, a first program, like something which solved a mathematical equation or something like that, I pretty much knew, I felt it in me that this is something that I want to do for the rest of my life. And fast forward like almost 30 years now, and I'm still enjoying it as much as I did on the first day.
That's cool. So you're saying your first language ever that you learned was Basic? So that's where you started?
Yes,
And
yes, it
that
was.
was so very early on. Then you decided. So did you actually then go to college for um, like a computer science degree or something similar to that?
Right. So yeah, I went to college and I had a computer science degree. Of course, in the meantime, I learned on my own as much as I could. Those
Mm,
were like a pretty strange times. For like we didn't really have internet or stuff like that. So
right.
basically, I would have to find like something from the computer papers, some program, and try to extrapolate from that. Or we would sometimes go to some bookshop in the center of the city, and then my parents would buy me some book in English, and I basically learned a lot of English simply because I had to learn it,
Mm,
because there was no other way. From those books, I learned a lot. Again, I would like read stuff and then extrapolate. And yeah, then I went to computer science college in late 90s through early 2000s, and yeah, that's where I also
mhm.
did a lot of programming and computer science theory and whatnot.
And I also went that route, but I have a question that's is still a very big question nowadays, which is, do you think that going to college for that computer science degree was helpful in the work that you do today, or would you like just by learning by yourself? And at the time with no internet, probably was harder to learn by yourself. But do you think you could achieve the same thing? Like be
Well, I mean, Yeah, that's a very good question. It's difficult to say, but I'm really happy you asked that question because I see a lot of polarizing opinions on the internet, like people saying you need computer science degree to be a programmer, or other people saying you absolutely don't need a computer science degree, and those others are more definitely more correct, so to speak. But yeah, I would say it's like for me personally, I really liked the fact that I went to that I studied computer science and I learned a lot in that. I also learned a lot before I did computer science, but that was maybe less organized knowledge. And for me, it worked well to be in the college, not just for learning stuff, but also because I actually uh, grew some, or I developed some working habits. I didn't really have those before I went to college. Like even though I was actually working part time or doing some programs and making some pocket money, out of that. In high school, I didn't really have proper working habits. So for me, that was really maybe even most beneficial of everything. But other stuff as well, like learning some theory, which I maybe wouldn't have learned myself. So for me, I'm really happy that I did it. But I also want to say that like you absolutely don't need computer science. You can also do it through other means, like especially these days when there are so many tutorials available both online, and otherwise, of course, a lot of material in different formats like books and casts and whatnot. And so whatever works for you, whatever gets you there, gets you there. So definitely people who didn't study are not like less of programmers than people who studied. There's no like strong correlation between any of that. But again, for me, I'm really happy that I did it.
For sure. So I'm sure that going through that experience, you've experimented in terms of coding different languages, programming languages. What would you say are for you the most influential? I'm not getting into Erlang and Elixir yet because we'll have time to talk about those. But before that, what were the most influential language you would say in how you write code right today?
Mm. Well, I guess that I spent before Erlang and Elixir, I spent some of the significant time writing C sharp, like in the early 2000s. So that was when at that time, I was sort of not a junior programmer anymore, and I would say that this is the time when a bunch of stuff shaped in my mind, and when I actually uh, developed some ideas or started understanding on how I think programs should be written. So maybe that one in that kind of context. But any language really is kind of brought something to the scene. So, I had a pleasure, again, going back to the college question, of working with Prolog during my student days. So we had to do some Prolog stuff, and I remember when I saw that for the first time, this was like literally the first language I saw which was not imperative, in the sense that you write do this and do that, and then you instead you write those declarations, and somehow magically the result appears. And I remember it took me, because I had these preconceptions from before, and it took me some time to wrap my mind around it, to actually understand it. But that was sort of eye-opening. And in the same way, SQL, which I also learned first in the university, also kind of show me the other way of expressing ideas, more declarative approaches, where you say what you want instead of how do you want to produce those results. I liked C and C++, worked a lot with those before C sharp. So those were like kind of more low level languages. I think back at the time I actually thought of them more as high level languages. But yeah, it's every single one brought something to the table.
Yeah. So then when does Erlang? Because you started with Erlang before Elixir, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Mhm.
When does Erlang come into play in your career?
Yeah, Erlang happened in 2010. So I was working for a company that was producing solutions for a betting company. So right around that time, we were implementing online betting. So that was like the first time here in Croatia that thing was happening, that it was actually permitted to have it. So we wrote like an online betting site, and then as a part of that, we had to write a so-called live betting feature. And live betting is you have a bunch of these matches. So you see those matches which are currently taking place. Like this is currently like, I don't know, you're in Portugal, so maybe Sporting and Braga, are playing, or is Braga club called Braga, or
Yes.
yeah, or so you see the lives, you see the events happening in that match, like someone scored a goal, or someone got a yellow card and stuff like that, and you can then place bets on stuff which is actually happening. And so you have like a bunch of those matches. Some of them are even more dynamic, like the football, or to translate for the Americans, soccer. It's not so. I mean, it's a dynamic sport, but not a lot changes during the course of the game. But then you have matches such as tennis or basketball, where you have really frequent changes of scores and whatnot. And we had to emit those things to a couple of thousand of connected users. So a user comes and that they pick their matches, and by default they get something like 20, 30 matches, and they get all these events in near real time. We cannot afford significant delays. And so, yeah, this was a challenge for us. And back in 2010, I think it was still relatively exotic. People were still talking about C10K challenge, like it was something very difficult to achieve. Our main stack at the time was Ruby, and we kind of pretty much figured out that we can't really do it with Ruby. Back at those days, I think Event Machine was maybe in something like 0.01 or something super early and unstable. Node.js, I'm not even sure if that thing existed, or maybe if it did, it was very early on. Same thing for Go, like those things that people would maybe pick today. Maybe even I would have picked those things with that mindset that I had at the time, something which seems more familiar. But anyway, Erlang seemed like pretty much the only technology available at that time which could allow us to solve that problem, and still retain our sanity. And so, yeah, this is what like my CTO at the time, he advised me, like Erlang seems like, something that could fit, why don't you read Joe's book and then try to make something out of it. And then I read Programming Erlang by Joe Armstrong, the creator of Erlang. And, I really liked the idea, but I still wasn't really sure, what am I going to do with that? And then I found the series of blog articles about building a push server in Erlang, which scales up to 1 million users, by Richard Jones, I believe. I hope I remember that correctly. And I basically took, some code snippets from that article and made a proof of concept. And ultimately, we put it back at the day. We put it on AWS Lambda. We started one huge instance, which was a server, and I think maybe something like 20 small instances to attack that server. And we left it overnight, and we basically were measuring if it holds up to like 10 times of the expected load. When it was a bogus implementation, it just accepted connections and pushed some fake updates. Nothing was implemented really, but it was just a proof of concept, and it worked effortlessly. I built this thing in a day. I had no clue what I was doing, but I was able to build it within a day, and it just at a scale which was for me completely unprecedented. I was working at maybe scale of, I don't know, tens or maybe a few hundred requests at a second. And this was like way above that, and it was pretty clear that Erlang is gonna be a good tool for the job.
And this was all in the same VM process, right? It's the same beam.
Yeah, it was the same beam.
No
yeah,
distribution, anything like that. No replication. So that was just out of the box.
Yeah. So basically, ultimately, I built some other stuff surrounding services in Erlang as well. So we actually ended up using distributed beam in a way which shouldn't really be used, because they weren't like replicas. I believe that when you use distributed beam, you really want to have like n replicas of the same thing. But what I really had was microservices which were talking over distributed beam. So that was a misuse, And I did hang on. Adobe Flash wants to update, so I'm just gonna cancel that. Okay. So. Yeah, I did a lot of things wrong, while I was doing that first implementation of the system. I was aggressively trying to, shoehorn Erlang into being an object-oriented language with mutability. So and I didn't really understand concurrency and OTP processes, so or OTP structure. How are you supposed to use that? I did like I was just spawning processes, just with spawn and stuff like that, and I didn't really use Gen server. I was rolling my own servers, and then every time I would like think, okay. How am I actually supposed to do this? So that there was no, Fred didn't write his book, Learn You Some Erlang or anything. There was way less resources, but I was
Yeah,
looking a
that's.
lot on the mailing
I
list.
was going to ask. So, at the time, did you feel that coming into Erlang as a beginner, that just the community wasn't there yet? Like weren't enough resources, books. I know forums were still a thing at that time.
Yeah, the community was definitely smaller. There was like mailing list, Erlang mailing list, which I think is still active, Erlang questions, and otherwise, you would search through blogs and whatnot. In terms of books, there was Joe's book, and there was another great book, which is called Erlang/OTP in Action. So that one is by Manning, and I read that book. That was my second book, which I read, and this is where things really fell into place. But other than that, my impression is that at the time, you had people who somehow knew things, and then you had a bunch of people like me who didn't know things. But I wasn't really. I didn't even know that what I don't know. I
Right.
didn't know what to ask. So it was strange times. But I spent a lot of times, just lurking on those mailing lists, and then I would find out about something, and oh wow, this exists, and I totally reinvented that stuff. But except it's 1,000 times worse, and so that's how it looked like. And but what I really want to say is that despite the fact that I did so many things wrong, is I was like super amazed that this system persevered, and there will be bugs in production, but it never really crashed completely. There were literal scenes when I would come to the office and I look at the logs and I see like a huge amount of crashes and whatnot, exceptions, and nobody paged me, nobody sent an email or something, and I ask support, were there some problems? I see a lot of bad stuff happening in the logs. No one really said anything. Things are working smoothly, and then I had to investigate why is the system even working? It should be dead.
Well, that's a good problem to have, right? I think the system just
Yeah.
works. But so at some point you discovered Elixir, and right? Was that on the same company, or had you moved to a different project?
Yeah, it was still the same company. I don't really change jobs so frequently. So
Yeah.
what happened is, as I grew more accustomed to Erlang, there were things that I absolutely like and still absolutely love, and then there were things which I wasn't really so happy about. Especially, given my background, I came from Ruby to Erlang, so I was used to like this catering to developers, which definitely was more present in Ruby. And yeah, I found somehow Erlang is, I like to say it's like super simple language, but basically this simplicity you trade off for expressiveness. And so I felt that I had to write a lot of boilerplate code, which I couldn't really effectively eliminate. I tried a bunch of different approaches, what with some dynamic runtime applications and Erlang macros, which are basically like C style macros, nothing like Elixir ones. And yeah, I wasn't really happy. And actually, at some point, I was looking into alternatives. Like I think it was around 2012 or so. I looked into Scala. I was really hoping that Scala is going to be something like Erlang, except maybe more expressive. And I guess my outcome is that it's definitely expressive, but I wasn't really happy. Somewhere in the middle, I just concluded that I'm just too stupid, that my brain is simply doesn't have the capacity to grasp everything happening in there. And then I tried Go as well. So my CTO introduced some small Go service, and Go looked really promising. But I feel really lucky that I actually was already working with Erlang, so I knew what to look for. And I saw some. From the standpoint of backend systems, some things which were severely lacking in Go, and some of them still are, like complete lack of fault tolerance. Then back at the time, Go scheduling was completely cooperative, and I think even these days it's not completely preemptive. So you can still end up in like infinite loop blocking the entire system. So yeah, I wasn't really completely happy with it, and my outcome was that ultimately it seems like the best Erlang is Erlang. and I sort of begrudgingly accepted that. And that's when I saw Elixir. I basically started writing some blog posts, and I figured, I might try writing those in Elixir. Maybe more people will read them, because I wanted to actually advertise Erlang to, like wider community. And as soon as I dived deeper into Elixir, and it was version 0.7, so way before 1.0, it had much less features, but it was like super great at the time. It was like the documentation was well organized already, even at such an early stage. Jose was super responsive, and basically because Elixir is, like a relatively lightweight wrapper around Erlang, I was very confident that it will work, and I immediately put it into production, as soon as I discovered it.
Cool. So a couple of things interesting, I think, that you said there. So first of all, you mentioned Go. I think to this day, when we're talking Elixir, I see a lot of people comparing it to Go. It's a very common comparison, and there's still a lot of companies choosing Go over anything else. Why do you think that is? Do you think there's like any particular use case in which it makes sense, or for you as a generic tool, you still prefer Elixir? I know you're a bit biased. I think we both are, being people that like Elixir, but I would like your opinion on
Yeah.
that.
So I guess people are comparing the two because, like Erlang has lightweight concurrency, Go has lightweight concurrency, but that's kind of like saying, this thing has integers and that thing has integers. I mean, sure, there are not so many languages that support lightweight concurrency, but still, yeah, that would be probably the main reason why people are comparing them, and why I compare them at the time. For me, my position is, and I think I said it, on forums and mailing lists and whatnot, that Erlang is a language built for software systems, which means backends, servers, software which has to run forever or for a long time with as little interruptions as possible. And you can clearly see that in design. It has stuff like fault tolerance. It has this frequent context switching, which helps you to get stable latency. It's not the fastest programming environment around, but it's it gives you stable latency, and for me stability is better than being the fastest, because you can reason about stable.
Right.
So yeah, this is what Erlang is about. You can write other stuff in Erlang. People have been writing, there is, I don't know if you heard of it, it's called Wings 3D, like a graphical 3D modeler written in Erlang. That's like an old application. People are writing command line tools and whatnot. You can write a bunch of stuff in Erlang, and of course Elixir as well. But I think that sweet spot are software systems. Go, on the other hand, for me, the sweet spot would be tools, like command line tools. One of programs, the program which a user starts and it either finishes or it completely fails. There is nothing in between, like when you have a command line tool, there is no high availability or fault tolerance.
Right.
It either produces the output or it doesn't, but those are the only two outcomes. And so you have some different kind of trade-offs there. And I think that what Go really did terrific is the deployment story. So the single deploy binary, like you can basically, I can produce here on my Mac, I can produce executable for Windows and just copy it over there and it works. We actually had at my previous company one such case where we had to build some tool for an external client, and I was arguing, we should use Go for that. This is what Go is built for, and so that's kind of my personal take. You can of course use anything for anything else. This is unfortunately, for better or worse, I think the history of IT, that we are using tools way beyond their intention. So I'm not really sure if that's a completely bad thing, but I would say that it's more bad than good in overall. But yeah, I think that software systems or backend systems, servers, stuff that runs forever and does a bunch of different things. Erlang is the platform designed for that, and I think by far the most mature platform, or the platform that has the biggest focus on that. When it comes to tooling, Go definitely has a very interesting story there, especially in the sense that we can that it allows us to produce binary, single binary, which we can deploy,
Makes
on many
sense. Yeah.
machines with. Yeah.
Yeah. So another thing. So thanks for that answer. I think it was very thorough. Um, another thing that you mentioned there is that when you started looking at Elixir and then you started blogging, you decided to blog in Elixir. Uh, just because you felt like people would be able to read it more, I think, or would be easier to read. My question then is, you would, I don't know if I understood what you said, but at some point you decided to also write a book on Elixir, right? So you wrote Elixir in Action, which was how I first got to know about you. Is also how I first started with Elixir. So that was like we did at Subvisual. We started with a book club reading Elixir in Action. That's how we mostly all of us started with Elixir at the time.
Oh, that's
This was like
cool.
4 years or ago now. Um, so thanks for that. That was very helpful for the company in general. But what was the decision like to, okay, I'm gonna write the book on Elixir now?
Mm. Well, I mean, I wasn't really gonna write a book on Elixir. I was just blogging. I was trying to spread the word, basically first and foremost about Erlang. And I guess my theory, I never really asked anyone, but what happened is somewhere around the time when I was starting blogging that, maybe, like a month later or so, Dave Thomas publicly announced programming Elixir. And you could really see the uptake of people in the community. I was already there on the mailing list, and there was like maybe 10 of us before Dave announced programming Elixir, and after that you could just see a bunch of people arriving to the scene. And so clearly there was something happening. I think we owe a lot to Dave for just pushing the language and making a name for it in a wider community. And I presume that Manning asked around, because also at the time O'Reilly also had one book already being written about Elixir, and so I presume Manning was trying to find some authors. I was probably one of the 5 people blogging about Elixir at the time. And my theory is that the other 4 declined the offer, and I was the one who accepted.
And what was that process like once you accepted it? Because I'm
Mm.
sure I've never actually went through the process of writing a book, especially not with a real publisher. But
Mm.
what's that like? Was it harder than you were expecting?
Well, no, no. I mean, when Manning approached me, before I actually gave them answer, I of course, went to www.google.com, and how does it look like to write a technical book? And there were actually, a couple of posts available. As far as I remember, there was actually one by a Manning author as well. So I pretty much knew what I was signing up for. It is a lot of work, but somewhere deep inside me, I knew that it's something that I want to do. That I enjoy doing, because I used to be in the early 2000s when I was finishing my university. I was a teacher, a part-time teacher, teaching C++ to people, and I wrote those blog posts, and my first company, I wrote some of the technical documentation. So I knew that I like to occasionally teach, not that maybe as a full-time profession, but it's something that I like to do. And so yeah, the whole process is you basically think a lot, then you write, and then you read like crazy. I think that I read this book maybe, I don't know, 20, 30 times or so.
That's a lot.
uh, yeah, so it's really the most difficult part is that you have to read through this stuff again and again and again. I think it's somewhere by the end, when I was asked to double check it once more for some last minute errors, it was so hard to do it. I just couldn't stand to look at it anymore. But no, other than that, I really enjoyed it. It's like I find it a very, very interesting challenge, very exciting challenge, to take like this complex topic and think, how am I going to, present it to people so they can actually understand. And so you do it chapter by chapter, and you kind of make some plan, and then you start writing, and then you read, and then you adapt the plan. And, I really had a lot of fun writing it.
Cool. Was it part of the process of your consideration how future-proof the book would be? Because I find Elixir in Action to still be a useful book for Elixir beginners, even now. That I think there's been different editions now, but
Mm.
even after all these years, was that part of the process?
Well, I definitely had some. I was thinking about what could change and what not. but I think maybe I got a bit lucky in general. So the thing when I started writing, or when I actually accepted for mining, I was thinking long and hard. Am I even going to do this because Dave Thomas is writing a book, and why would I even want to compete with Dave? That's like no point doing that. Yeah. So, but then I took a look at Dave's outline. So there was already a table of content on the pragmatic page. And given that outline, my impression was that Dave's book is going to be more on the functional side of things, and I thought, I think it makes sense to treat the concurrency stuff and OTP with more details. And as it just so happens, this is the part which is most stable. So that was quite lucky thing. Although ultimately, when I wrote the second edition, I had to change a bulk of those chapters because there were some changes like registry arriving to Elixir and supervisor child specifications and whatnot. Now it's also a bit outdated, but only in the last chapter because when I wrote it, we still didn't have releases in Elixir, so I use distillery. But yeah, other than that, it's relatively stable. Yeah.
Cool. And at the time, were you expecting such a good reaction from the community in receiving the book?
I had really no clue, what is going to look like. So I mean, basically, you have someone like Dave writing, and clearly way more popular and better author and whatnot, more established, and then you have some anonymous person like me. Maybe a couple of people heard of me in the Elixir community, but we're talking maybe dozens of people at the best. So I really was kind of worried that maybe it's going to be a flop, like no one is ever going to read it. So I guess I got to say thank you to all the early adopters who actually started reading the book even before it was fully published and gave some terrific feedback. And there were people, actually advertising the book on Twitter, not like, Manning's Machinery or something, but, just some casual reader, they read the book and they just post a comment. And I always find this like super encouraging. Yeah, but ultimately, I just said to myself, I'm going to write a book which feel I'm happy about, the reviewers are happy about, and then hopefully, it's going to go well. And I guess I'm happy to see or to learn, that people are actually reading the book. And yeah, I get like those unsolicited comments, and that's really like the best part of writing a book. When someone tells you like, "Oh, thank you for writing it."
Yeah, even now here in chat we have people that are saying that they want to thank you for the book and your talks, and that's how they started writing Elixir in their day-to-day job, which is a really good thing.
Cool.
So you've been part of the Erlang, Elixir, and you said the Ruby community. What's your understanding of how this community works? How this community works? So the Erlang community, Elixir community. Do you think at this point you can consider them one community, or there's still a divide between like the old school Erlangers and people doing Elixir nowadays?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I'm pretty sure there has to be some divide. There are like Erlangers who don't really care about Elixir, which is fine. Also, as I myself have moved to Elixir, so up until maybe 4 years ago, I was still using Erlang actively, but now these days I'm using Elixir, and I basically don't really follow Erlang questions, mailing list, or stuff like that. I don't follow what's happening there. I probably should, but there's just there are so many hours in the day. And so to that extent, we ultimately, all go into our specializations. But, what really makes me happy is I see a lot of cooperation as well. There is the Erlang Ecosystem Foundation, and people are, actively working on trying to solve some problems together. The conferences are, like from Erlang Solutions, they are called Code Sync or Code Beam events, and they are clearly oriented around Beam. So any language is welcome, whether it's Elixir, Erlang, or the new one, what's it called by Lewis, the typed, now I'm blocking. Gleam, yeah, Gleam. Sorry. So yeah, there is definitely a lot of cooperations, which is definitely great. I mean, in Elixir, we basically owe everything we have to not just to Erlang, but also to libraries from that ecosystem, like I don't know, Cowboy, Web Server,
Yep.
or things like that. So we definitely use a lot of those from the ecosystem, and we should work together.
Yeah. So you're also a prolific open source contributor, right? More or less,
I
if you
think of
look at.
myself as, I'm an occasional open source contributor.
But you have a lot of projects going on your profile on GitHub. At least you can see a few, and you also contribute to other projects a little bit.
A little bit, yeah.
What's your experience there with open source? Is something that you enjoy doing, or you just see as something that you need to do to help the community? I don't know.
So, I mean, definitely, as a part of my daily work, I try to make contribution whenever, I encounter the problem. Most of the times we are talking about fixing type specification errors. I think occasionally I fixed some bug or something like that. I made a few relatively minor contributions to Elixir itself. I think probably my biggest claim to fame there is that I wrote the original implementation of the mix profiler task, mix fprof or however it's called. So if I'm working on it or if I'm using this library and I see some problem or whatnot, of course I'm going to help. And otherwise, I had some ideas as a part of my work, and so I try to formalize those as libraries. I do that at my own free time, so this allows me to, claim the ownership to those libraries. So, it's mine. I'm going to write a library, then we can maybe use it in a business project. But this is something what I try to, do on my own time. And I guess, I didn't really. I've been enjoying it because I didn't spend too much energy on it. So I think I see a lot of people burning out. It feels that, like you just give your heart and soul into that, and then at some point you feel a burnout. And maybe it's lucky for me that I just, started doing open source in my early 30s. So I kind of knew that, I don't want to go all in to that, without sleeping at all or whatnot. I try to make it, at a sustainable pace so I can still enjoy it.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So you're saying that a lot of what you do is related to work. So whenever you see a bug, you try to fix that. So as I understand it now, you two things. So first, you said, as you said, you stay in companies for a long time. From what I could see, that's something that happens with you. But also you're now. So I looked up on LinkedIn, and you say officially your title is Elixir Mentor. So what exactly is it that you're doing nowadays?
Okay, so I'm working. You can say consulting. I try to avoid the term because it has some bad connotations, which it shouldn't. I mean, but still. So I'm working with a company called Very Big Things, and Very Big Things is a digital agency. They just build products as products on order, and they have a strict division between front-end developers and back-end developers, and they have standardized the stack, and so on back-end Elixir is exclusively used. And so they've been using this even before they approached me. They've been delivering software successfully. Clients are happy and everything, but still they weren't really completely sure about the internals of how are they doing things right or not. They weren't really clear on that, and which is not surprising, because Elixir is a relatively young language still, and I think that I was there since before 1.0, and I think that as a community, all of us are trying to still find a way of what would be considered as idiomatic versus non-idiomatic, And so to their credit, they instead of just being focused on shipping shipping more things faster, they actually wanted to take some time to organize the internals to learn how to write better Elixir, and so they approached me, and that's how I defined my role as an Elixir mentor. And what this means is basically I try to help companies to adopt and work with Elixir. So that ranges from stuff such as doing code reviews and then mentoring people or explaining to people, how things could be written in a different, hopefully better way, devising some strategies and bootstrap material for new people coming to the company, proposing some or reviewing technical architecture when it's related to Elixir. So things like that, everything related to Elixir, but not necessarily the implementation. So yeah, that's what I do. I'm currently basically my full time is occupied for very big things. Occasionally I have like a small short consulting gig, maybe hour or so, but yeah, that's how it goes.
Okay. So in that experience, I'm sure you see a lot of like different apps, different uses of Elixir. And my question is, what do you see as the next phase for Elixir, the next couple of years? Is there any particular project, initiative that you see coming up that will be will be a game changer in Elixir, or anything interesting in general?
Well, it's going to be a boring answer, but like most of the community, I'm super excited about live view. So that is the thing. Seriously, like when I think about some of the stuff that I've done, I can definitely see a lot of potential for those stuff being written with live view and how they could be simpler. The live betting thing that I mentioned, which was written, I mean, in Erlang, but still, that's like sounds like a prime candidate for live view, because basically we were, shipping stuff over socket and then having a lot of JavaScript to deal with that. We had to manually try to compress the traffic, being shipped to the other side. This is like sounds like a perfect case for live view, and we're talking about a use case at scale. Then at Aircloak, my former company, we had some web, which was I call it a nice to have web. Well, we needed to have it, but it wasn't really our prime interface. We were exposing more programmatic interfaces, but we still needed web, at least for demo purposes. And so we had some React and whatnot, and no one really wanted or paid enough attention to that front end machinery. And basically, if we had live view, like there will be a lot of amount of that complexity, just going away, and we would be able to focus more on the core challenges. Yeah.
It's funny that you mentioned React, because I was going to ask the question, because a lot of times I really like live view as well. It's something that I'm really experimenting a lot with, especially now with a library called Surface. I don't know if you heard of it.
That's for the components, right?
Yes. Yeah, it allows you to create React-like, in terms of syntax, components for live view. But my question was more, a lot of people compare live view with React, obviously, React being such a big front-end framework right now. What are your thoughts on React versus live view? Do you think it's more of a thing from a company coming from Elixir? Elixir, you like live view more, and if you're coming from React, you like it more. I'm sure that's true. But in terms of architecture, just productivity, what's your how do you like those different concepts?
So I can't really say. Yeah, the thing is that even when I used React, I just used very basics. I didn't even feel like going deeper into understanding it. At the same time, the live view, I used it for a demo of my talk about a year ago, and then I didn't really work with it. And I just saw Chris's demo of Twitter, and live view is definitely something that I want to start working with more, at least at my own free time. To explore it. So I cannot really compare them technically. What I can say is my gut feeling is, and shouldn't be surprising that things should be simpler, at least in smaller to medium cases with a live view, because, there's just less technology. There are less moving parts to work with. So, I have like a blog, for example. My blog is written in Phoenix, and I have some JavaScript there. And I want to remove this, and I think that with live view I can simplify that stuff. So yeah, I think that live view definitely makes sense in a bunch of places. Has its limitation too, of course, but it's still pretty new, so we have to figure that out. Yeah.
Makes
I should
sense.
just add, I don't know how many people know this, but at my former company, where I learned Erlang and Elixir, I was more like a full stack developer.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were working a lot with JavaScript, mostly vanilla JavaScript with a little bit of jQuery maybe. And I actually like that. But then somewhere around, what was it? I think 2013 or so, these frameworks started emerging. I think first one was Bootstrap maybe, and then there was stuff like, I don't know,
Backbone. Yeah,
Knockout.js.
Backbone at the
Backbone,
time. Yeah.
Backbone, Backbone. Exactly, that's the one. Yeah, and then there was like an Angular one and whatnot. And I evaluated some of those, and I I gotta say I wasn't really thrilled. And somewhere around that point, I just stepped away and figured out that I don't really want to work with front end anymore, because it seems like these frameworks are popping out, at a incredible rate, and by the time you learn one, another is already, that one is
Yeah.
deprecated and something else came along, and I felt like I'm going to spend a lot of energy, learning things which don't really make me happy, and that's when I fell back to the backend side of things.
Now a bit calmer, but I do remember those times. That's when I was getting into professional programming and full stack, and it was crazy. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Moving to a different part of Elixir that we're talking about this a little bit before we went live, which is umbrella apps, right? So you have a library called Boundary that
Mm-hmm.
tries to solve similar issues, kind of. Do you want to give a quick overview of what Boundary does and how it relates to umbrella apps?
Mm. Yeah, so Boundary tries to help people to enforce more rules into who can call whom, so to speak. So I mean, what do we have in Beam? You have like a module, and module is always visible to everyone else in Beam, so you can call any public function from the module. And that's essentially the visibility rules. And so people are frequently, or at least occasionally, using umbrellas to try to somehow limit that, to introduce some order into their code, because you don't really want to have everyone calling everyone else. That's impossible to reason about. And so Boundary came out of belief that umbrellas are not the right tool for that job, and that we are essentially lacking a tool which properly solves that problem. It's based, the initial implementation was based on the API from the xref task. So you have mix xref, which can tell you who calls whom. And I figured, okay, so this gives me enough data to get to get the call data, to understand which module is calling some other modules, and actually get the line number and everything. And then we have to expose some way to the users, to the programmers, to list like, so what you can do is you can say, I have my context modules, and they are not allowed to call web modules. And then I have web modules. They are allowed to call modules from the context, but only these modules, not every single one. So that's the idea. Basically, with Boundary, like let's say I have my system, which is context, and I have my system web, which is web tier. So you can draw two boundaries. You can say my system is one boundary, and everything under that, my system.foo, my system.bar, everything falls into that boundary. Same thing for web. And then you export which modules are actually visible to the outside world.
Mhm.
And you finally, the third piece of the puzzle is dependencies. So you can say the web boundary depends on the context boundary. Does that make sense?
Yes, well, at least for me, I think it does. One question I was
Mm.
going to ask is, so this still happens in one application, right? Still one OTP application.
Yeah, the idea is I didn't even try it out in Umbrella. I've heard from a friend contacted me a few days earlier, and I heard that like supposedly it's working. There are some glitches, so I have to look it up. But essentially, my position is that you shouldn't be using umbrellas for something which runs together in production. I think that even Jose mentioned that. I think Jose describes this, if I remember correctly, as monolith disguised as a boundary or something like that. So the way I understand it, umbrella. I'm mixing things up. It's getting a bit late here. Yeah. So for me, the idea of umbrella is like you have these independent Veeam systems, which are deployed independently and running independently, but you're going to run them locally in a single beam to make things simpler. This is what I would use umbrella for, and only this.
That makes sense because, as I was saying, we had one large umbrella application, and for example, one thing that's, in my opinion, particularly hard, if you're trying to do what you're saying, if you're trying to have a monolith that you just break down the contexts in different umbrella apps, what the dependency management here is pretty weird, because your like all the dependencies will be installed in the main app and not in the different umbrellas. So then you have like conflicting versions all across umbrellas, and it gets painful. That's why I was asking if it's just one application, you still have just one mix file.
Mm.
So your dependencies
My,
are all in the same place. So it's
So yeah, my strong belief is that when we're talking about code organization, you don't need more than one project. Multiple projects don't really help you here. In fact, they unhelp you because they add more complexity to the problem. You have to deal, like here with umbrellas, you have to deal with these configurations, with dependencies, and you still get substandard results. You still don't have like the full control of who can call whom. So my position is that one app or one project should be fine to organize the dependencies. And if we cannot do this currently, then we are lacking some tools to help us do that. That's all.
do you think any of those tools should get into Elixir Core, or the opposite? Do you think that umbrellas should not be part of Elixir Core?
Well, I think it's fine that umbrellas are there. I don't really use them myself because, yeah, I just don't use them. I don't
Yeah,
really
I'm
think
asking
that.
just because of the opportunity for misuse. Like you have something in the core of the language, and there's the opportunity for misuse. Uh, I'm asking because this is common in a lot of languages, but I don't think it's very common in
Mhm.
Elixir. Everything that's on the core of the language is usually very easy to use, and hard to misuse. I think that's something. Uh,
Well, one could say a lot about that. I think a lot of things are misused in Beam, especially in Elixir. I would say
hmm.
I'm like a big, well-known ranter about application configuration. Which I think should be minimized as much as possible. Then there is a problem which everyone does. I did it, at some point to use gen servers to somehow like simulate mutability, to make it seem more object oriented, like so it takes a while until these ideas sit in, and ultimately the thing is that Beam is really a completely different platform from pretty much anything that you have seen in other languages, except maybe, I don't know, Scala with Akka, because Akka drives a lot of inspiration from
Yeah.
Erlang, right? But other than that, not even Go really comes close to that. So it takes a while to get adapted to those ideas. But yeah, things can be misused. Umbrellas are, in my opinion, definitely misused. Every now and then I see people, just saying, explaining how they use umbrellas just to organize the code when ultimately everything runs in a single beam, always, everywhere. I think that this can be done in a single project. And if this can't be done today in a single project, then we are lacking something in the tooling, and boundaries. My attempt to address that issue.
Is there any particular feature you'd like to see on Elixir that's not there yet?
Wow, that is a very good question. I'm gonna have to think about it and get back to you on that.
Okay, you can
Yeah, I
answer
think it's
on the
pretty.
spot.
I gotta say, that I really like. I mean, especially in the early days, I was also one of the people who were pushing for stuff which definitely, in hindsight, were not needed. I have deep respect for Jose and the core team, standing